The courtroom was thick with tension as Officer Brian Mitchell stood confidently at the front, his uniform sharp and pressed, his demeanor cold and dismissive. He had been here countless times before, playing his part in a system he believed would always protect him. Today, however, was different. Today he was facing someone he didn't expect, someone he didn't know how to deal with. Mariah Turner sat in the defendant's chair, her back straight, her face calm and composed. She wore a tailored suit, a quiet symbol of the power she had worked so hard to attain. Every inch of her body spoke of resilience, of a woman who had learned how to survive in a world that often saw her as less than. She had been wrongfully accused of assaulting Officer Mitchell during an arrest, a charge she knew was a direct result of his racist behavior. The prosecutor had called Mitchell to the stand first, hoping his testimony would secure a quick win. As the officer spoke, his voice was confident, his words dripping with the certainty that only a man who had never been held accountable could have. He painted a picture of a violent and unruly woman, one who had attacked him without provocation. He recounted the moments of the supposed confrontation, twisting the truth to fit his narrative. Every word that came out of his mouth was designed to make Mariah appear dangerous, to paint her as someone who deserved to be locked away, far from society. Mitchell didn't even glance at Mariah as he spoke, his gaze fixed firmly on the judge and the jury, but when his eyes briefly flickered toward her, he couldn't suppress a small mocking smile. It was the kind of look that said he knew something she didn't. He believed the courtroom was his domain, and no matter how much she fought, she would never win against him or the system he represented. Mariah knew this, of course. She had felt this weight her entire life, the weight of being underestimated, the weight of being written off because of the color of her skin. It wasn't the first time a man like Mitchell had looked at her like she was nothing more than a problem to be dealt with. But something had changed in her. The woman who had once been afraid to speak up, who had once hesitated to fight back, no longer existed. This Mariah was a woman who had learned to navigate the system, to break through barriers, and create spaces where she could stand tall. She wasn't just a defendant today, she was the one who would expose the truth. Despite the anger that simmered within her, Mariah remained silent, her eyes steady on Officer Mitchell as he continued his testimony. Every word he said seemed to fuel the fire inside her, but she kept her composure. She knew the truth would come out. She had learned long ago that patience was often the most powerful weapon in the fight for justice. As Mitchell wrapped up his testimony, he shot a final glance at Mariah, his smirk still in place. He had said everything he needed to say to convince the jury that she was guilty. His role was finished. He was confident she wouldn't be able to prove him wrong, that his version of events would stand unchallenged. The judge nodded, signaling for the defense to begin. Mariah's lawyer stood and began to ask questions, but it was clear the battle was already won in the officer's mind. He'd played his part, and the rest was just formality. He was already thinking about his next case, already dismissing Mariah as just another statistic in a long line of black defendants who would never stand a chance. Mariah Turner sat still in the defendant's chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes focused ahead. The courtroom around her buzzed with the normal noise of legal proceedings, the shuffle of papers, the rustle of clothing, the low murmurs of the jury members as they exchanged glances, but Mariah barely noticed any of it. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the events that had led her to this very moment, the unjust arrest, the false accusations, and the way Officer Brian Mitchell had twisted the truth to suit his narrative. She had learned to tune out the noise long ago, to remain centered in moments like these, when the weight of the world felt as if it were pressing down on her. In a way, she had been training for this moment all her life. She had learned the hard way that the world rarely saw a black woman for what she truly was, smart, capable, worthy of respect. Instead, she had often been viewed through a lens shaped by stereotypes, by assumptions, by biases, that no amount of hard work or success could erase. As Mitchell spoke, sitting there with his smug expression and confident tone, Mariah thought about the many times she had been in situations like this, times when her voice was ignored, when she was silenced by the system, She had been silenced by others, by the laws that didn't protect her, by the people who refused to see her as equal. And she had been silenced by herself too, as she fought to make herself smaller to fit into the spaces that were carved out for people like her. But not today. Today, she wouldn't shrink. She had nothing to prove to anyone. She had worked too hard, fought too long, to allow someone like Mitchell to define her, to reduce her to nothing more than the woman he wanted her to be. Her eyes never wavered from him, even as his voice droned on, recounting the supposed events of that night. The night he had pulled her over, the night he had escalated a simple traffic stop into a full-blown altercation. She remembered that moment all too clearly. The officer's rough hands grabbing her arm, his voice full of hostility, the way he had refused to listen when she tried to explain. It had all happened so quickly, so violently, that she hadn't been able to fully process it until afterward. Officer Mitchell had painted the scene as if she had attacked him unprovoked, as if she had somehow brought the violence onto herself. It wasn't the first time she had encountered this kind of behavior from law enforcement, but it still stung every time. It was as if the world expected black women to quietly endure injustice, to take it all in stride, to be invisible in the face of aggression. Mariah clenched her jaw, but she remained silent. Every fiber of her being wanted to stand up, to scream at him, to tell him that she would not be a part of his lie, but she knew that would only give him the power he wanted. Anger would not be her weapon today. Patience, precision, and grace would be her strength. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with a sharp suit and a tight smile, sat back in his seat, looking pleased with Mitchell's testimony. He hadn't noticed how Mitchell's narrative was crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. The small, careful details, the way Mitchell had failed to mention the aggressive tactics he had used during the arrest, the way his story never quite added up with the evidence. None of it mattered to the prosecutor, though. To him, the officer was a reliable source of truth, and Mariah was just another defendant in a broken system. Mariah could feel the eyes of the jury on her, some of them skeptical, others unsure, their faces a mix of judgment and curiosity. She could feel the prejudices swirling in the air, the assumptions they were making about her, the preconceptions that had likely been formed long before she even stepped into the courtroom. But she didn't allow herself to be rattled by them. She had been underestimated her whole life, and yet here she was, fighting for her freedom, standing tall in the face of it all. Her lawyer continued to ask questions, but Mariah didn't hear them. Her focus remained solely on Mitchell. She was studying him now, watching for the smallest cracks in his facade. She knew something he didn't, something he would soon find out. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, the kind of silence that precedes something explosive. Officer Brian Mitchell's smugness was palpable, a shield he wore with the ease of someone who had always been shielded by the law. He didn't just wear his uniform, he embodied it, as if it granted him the unquestioned authority to dictate the course of events. Mariah could see how he carried himself with that quiet arrogance, how he played his part in this well-rehearsed system that too often overlooked the truth when it didn't fit a particular narrative. As the prosecutor gave his final remarks after Mitchell's testimony, Mariah sat still, her posture unwavering. Her lawyer, a man of considerable experience but not of the same fiery passion Mariah had inside her, was preparing to cross-examine the officer. It should have been a moment where the defense seized the opportunity to challenge the lies Mitchell had spun. But Mariah knew deep down, the real battle was already taking place in the minds of the jury. They were deciding how they saw her, and the more they listened to Mitchell, the more their perceptions would be shaped by his authority and position. She wasn't naive. She understood how the system worked. A black woman, especially one who didn't fit the stereotypical image of a respectable person, was already at a disadvantage. She had fought those battles in smaller, less formal arenas for years. It was exhausting to constantly prove that she belonged, that she wasn't what they assumed. Every glance, every judgment from the people around her, whether intentional or unconscious, added another layer to the burden she carried. She had spent so many years being told she was too much or not enough, too loud, too opinionated, too ambitious. And now here she was, again fighting to prove her worth, fighting to be seen for who she truly was. Mitchell's testimony was slick, too clean in its contradictions. He had painted a scene where he was the victim, where her actions had escalated from minor disobedience to a full-blown confrontation. He had made it clear that he was the law and she was just an obstacle in his path. The officer hadn't even hesitated to accuse her of striking him without provocation, as if that was the only way to explain his actions. It was a story that should have made her angry, but instead it left her numb. She had heard it all before, the way the police could twist events to fit their narrative, the way their word was held as truth while hers was dismissed as fiction. Yet, she couldn't let herself sink into despair. She couldn't afford the luxury of being angry, not yet. She knew she had to remain calm, remain composed. She was no longer just a defendant in this case, she had a role to play, a greater purpose in this fight. Mariah had made it this far in life by using the tools that others couldn't see, by playing a game where the rules were stacked against her but still managing to win. And right now, in this courtroom, the game was far from over. Her lawyer began his questioning of Mitchell, his tone professional and measured. But Mariah could see the cracks beginning to show. The officer was beginning to shift uncomfortably in his seat, his confident smirk faltering with every pointed question. He had prepared his story well, but Mariah had known from the beginning that truth had a way of revealing itself in the most unexpected ways. Mitchell was starting to flounder, his responses less certain, his explanations more convoluted. The cracks in his version of events were beginning to appear, and Mariah felt a faint glimmer of hope spark inside her. She knew the strategy: find the inconsistencies, exploit them, make the lies unravel in front of everyone. But more importantly, she knew it wasn't just about winning this case. This was bigger than just her. It was about showing the world that no matter how deeply entrenched the system of bias was, it could still be challenged, still be held accountable. Mariah was no longer just fighting for her innocence. She was fighting for the millions of others who had never had a voice in these situations, the ones whose stories were always overshadowed, dismissed, ignored. As her lawyer continued to press Mitchell on the details of that night, Mariah's mind wandered for just a moment. She thought about the countless others who had been through this same ordeal, the men and women who had been wronged, accused, and punished without a fair trial. How many times had the truth been buried under lies like this? How many had been silenced by a system that didn't care to listen? Mitchell's discomfort was palpable now, his answers more defensive, his earlier arrogance slipping into uncertainty. The stage was being set, and though she had remained calm throughout, Mariah knew the moment to strike was coming. She wasn't just a victim in this case, she was the reckoning, the one who would remind everyone in this room that justice didn't only belong to those who wore badges, but to those who dared to stand up and demand it. The courtroom had fallen into an uneasy silence, as if everyone had collectively held their breath. The tension was palpable. The jury, the judge, even the prosecution and defense attorneys, were all waiting for something. No one had expected this moment. No one had anticipated that Mariah Turner would be the one to shake the very foundation of the trial. Mariah stood up slowly, her heels clicking against the hard floor as she moved with an unspoken elegance that commanded attention. For a brief moment, her eyes swept across the room. She caught the eyes of the jurors one by one, their faces a mixture of confusion, curiosity, and disbelief. She could sense their uncertainty, feel the weight of their preconceived judgments that had built up with every word Officer Mitchell had spoken. Now she had their full attention. Her lawyer had paused, clearly caught off guard by her decision to take control of the moment. He had been prepared to cross-examine Mitchell, to dismantle the officer's testimony, but Mariah wasn't going to wait. She wasn't going to let this trial be decided by anyone other than herself. This wasn't just about her case anymore, it was about the power of truth, the power of holding the system accountable. She wasn't just going to defend herself. She was going to expose the lies that had held her and so many others down for far too long. The judge's gaze flickered toward her, as if unsure of what she was about to do. "Mrs. Turner, are you prepared to testify?" he asked, his voice a little more tentative than usual. Mariah didn't respond with words. Instead, she reached into her bag, her hand moving with the precision of someone who had done this before. The courtroom watched her every movement, some puzzled, others anticipating. She pulled out a sleek, polished object and placed it carefully on the table in front of her. It gleamed under the harsh courtroom lights, a symbol of power and authority that no one had expected to see in the hands of a defendant. A Supreme Court Justice badge. Gasps echoed throughout the room. Even Officer Mitchell, whose arrogance had once been so unwavering, froze in his seat, his eyes widening in disbelief. Mariah's heart didn't race. Her hands didn't tremble. Instead, she felt a strange sense of calm. A quiet assurance that she was doing exactly what needed to be done. She wasn't just any woman standing here. She was someone who had worked her entire life to reach this moment, to attain this position, to prove that the system could be shaken, could be held accountable. The room was still, as if time itself had momentarily stopped. The judge blinked a few times, trying to process what had just happened. The jury stared at her in shock, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what they were seeing. The defense attorney, who had been silent throughout, quickly shuffled through his papers, seemingly trying to catch up with the reality of what had just unfolded before them. Officer Mitchell, still frozen in place, slowly shifted his weight, his confidence suddenly crumbling. He looked from Mariah to the badge on the table and back again, his mouth opening and closing, as if trying to find words that wouldn't come. The officer, who had been so sure of his position, who had thought he could easily silence a black woman in a courtroom, now found himself questioning everything. This wasn't a defendant he could belittle. This was a woman who had, in an instant, thrown everything he thought he knew about power into question. Mariah kept her gaze fixed on him, her eyes unwavering, her presence filling the room. There was no boastfulness in her demeanor, no show of arrogance, only the quiet strength of someone who had fought too long and too hard to be dismissed. The badge wasn't a weapon, it was a symbol of the years of education, of struggle, of perseverance that had led her to the highest echelons of the legal world. "Officer Mitchell," she said calmly, her voice carrying the weight of authority that no one had seen coming, "I am not just a defendant here today. I am a Supreme Court Justice." She paused for a moment, letting the words settle. "And I know the truth of what happened that night." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. It was as if Mariah's words had cut through the fog of confusion and disbelief, creating a clarity that none of them had expected. The truth, in that moment, was undeniable. Mitchell was no longer just the officer on the stand. He was now a man who had been exposed. The lies he had told, the distortion of the facts, everything he had spun as truth, was now under scrutiny in a way he couldn't ignore. Mariah didn't need to shout or raise her voice. Her presence, her badge, her very existence in that room was a challenge to everything Mitchell had believed about his power. She was not just a woman who had been wronged, she was a woman who was about to change the entire narrative. The courtroom was still, the air heavy with anticipation as the reality of Mariah's revelation sank in. Officer Mitchell's face was an open book of disbelief, his composure shattered in an instant. The smug, self-assured aura he had worn so confidently now hung around him like an ill-fitting cloak. He shifted uneasily in his chair, his eyes darting between the Supreme Court Justice badge on the table and Mariah, who stood before him with unflinching poise. The prosecutor, who had been sitting back, his arms crossed smugly as if the case had already been decided, now looked uncertain, His gaze flickered from the badge to Mariah and then back to Mitchell. The defense lawyer, whose posture had been casual only moments before, was now leaning forward, his brow furrowed in confusion and concern. The jurors were frozen, their faces a mixture of shock, curiosity, and awe. They had come into this trial with their own biases, their own judgments, but now all of that was being challenged by the woman standing in front of them. Mariah didn't flinch. Her hands were still steady as she kept her gaze firmly on Officer Mitchell. She could hear the thoughts racing through the room, the whispers, the doubts. How could someone like her, someone who had been painted as an aggressor, a criminal, hold such a position of power? How could a black woman, accused of assault, be the very symbol of justice? But she had earned that badge. She had fought for every piece of it, every step of her journey to the Supreme Court. The struggles, the sleepless nights, the endless battles against a system that had constantly tried to tear her down, all of it had led her to this point. Mariah Turner was not just any woman, she was a force. And now, everyone in the room had to confront that truth. She took a deliberate step forward, her heels echoing in the hushed silence. "Officer Mitchell," she said, her voice steady and clear. "You stand here accusing me of something that never happened. You've twisted the facts to fit your narrative, one that seeks to undermine the very justice system that I have dedicated my life to. But no longer will I let you, or anyone else, control the story. The truth is not on your side, and today I will make sure it's heard." The officer's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His earlier bravado, the belief that he could manipulate the facts to serve his own version of events, had crumbled. The courtroom was no longer a place where his authority was unchallenged. Mariah's mere presence had exposed the cracks in the story he had told, and now it was time for her to show everyone what those cracks had concealed. Mariah turned to the jury, meeting their eyes one by one. "You've heard what he said, but let's talk about the truth. Let's talk about the fact that Officer Mitchell initiated an altercation when there was no need for one. Let's talk about the evidence that proves I never assaulted him, that the violence I was accused of was nothing but a fabrication. I stand before you today not as a victim, but as someone who knows the truth, and will fight to ensure that truth comes out." She could see the jury's expressions shift, their skepticism now giving way to a growing awareness. The cracks in Mitchell's testimony were not just apparent, they were glaring. The things he had left unsaid, the moments he had twisted to his advantage, were now under intense scrutiny. Mariah didn't need to shout, didn't need to raise her voice. Her words carried the weight of the law, the weight of her experience, and the undeniable power of truth. Mitchell's discomfort was palpable now, his back stiff and his eyes darting nervously. He could feel the walls closing in on him. The officer had been used to playing the role of the unquestioned authority, the one who stood above reproach. But now his position was unraveling. The very system that had protected him for so long was now being turned on its head. It wasn't just Mariah who was challenging him, it was the very justice system he claimed to serve. Her lawyer, who had been watching the exchange with a mixture of surprise and admiration, finally spoke up. "Your Honor, I would like to request a recess. It's clear that the officer's testimony is no longer holding up under scrutiny. We need time to review the additional evidence we have gathered, which completely contradicts his version of events." The judge, still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred, nodded slowly, his face a picture of hesitation and contemplation. He wasn't accustomed to seeing a defendant take control of the courtroom in this way. Mariah had done what most defendants couldn't even dream of doing. She had dismantled the very foundation of the case against her. Mitchell sat in stunned silence, his confidence shattered. The room had shifted in a way that no one could have anticipated. What had started as a routine trial had now become something far larger. This was no longer about the fight between a defendant and an officer. It was a battle for the truth. And Mariah Turner was winning. The courtroom was now charged with an electric energy, a sense of collective anticipation that hung in the air like a weight. The recess had done little to calm the storm brewing beneath the surface. Officer Mitchell sat at the witness stand, his once confident posture now broken, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as though holding on to whatever shred of control he had left. Mariah sat in her seat, her face calm and composed, but inside she was burning with the quiet power of someone who knew that the truth was on her side. The jury, which had been uncertain just hours earlier, now watched her with a new level of respect, a new understanding of the gravity of the situation. They could feel the shift in the room, the way the narrative was no longer being controlled by the familiar voices of authority, but instead by a woman who had refused to be intimidated, refused to let her story be buried beneath the weight of lies. The defense lawyer, who had once been sitting comfortably behind his desk, was now scribbling furiously on a notepad, his mind racing to catch up with what was unfolding before him. The judge, an older man with a reputation for stoicism, leaned forward on his bench, his eyes narrowing as he observed the interactions in the room. He had presided over countless cases in his career, but never one like this. Never one where a defendant had taken such complete control, dismantled the prosecution's case, and stood in front of the jury not just as a person seeking justice, but as a symbol of it. The badge, which had once seemed like a mere piece of metal, now loomed large over the proceedings, representing something far more significant than anyone could have anticipated. Mitchell's discomfort was now apparent to everyone in the room. The certainty he had exuded earlier was gone. He was a man who had built his career on the assumption that the system would always protect him, that his word, backed by his uniform, would never be questioned. But Mariah had exposed the flaws in that system. She had shown that the law wasn't a tool to be used against those who were vulnerable, but a weapon that could be wielded by those who truly understood it. And Mariah Turner in that moment was proving that the law, when used correctly, had the power to dismantle the very injustices it had been used to perpetuate. Mitchell's eyes darted toward the badge once more, the weight of its symbolism sinking in. He had seen the badge in the hands of powerful people before. Judges, lawyers, law enforcement officers, but never in the hands of someone like Mariah. Someone who had been marginalized, overlooked, and wronged. Someone who had fought not just for her own justice, but for the justice of others who had been silenced. Mariah stood when the recess ended, her voice calm and unwavering. "Your Honor, the truth has already been revealed in this courtroom," she said, turning her attention to the judge. Her words were not an accusation but a statement of fact. "Officer Mitchell's testimony has been proven false. The evidence we presented, my own testimony, the physical evidence, and the inconsistencies in the officer's account, has already done what it was meant to do. The truth is no longer a matter of opinion, it's a matter of record, and that record speaks for itself." The judge nodded, his gaze shifting to Mitchell, who was now visibly sweating. His previous arrogance had been replaced with an air of desperation. He could feel the eyes of the jury on him, the weight of their judgment growing heavier with each passing second. The jury, which had been watching the case unfold with their own doubts, now seemed more convinced than ever that the officer's story had crumbled under the pressure of the truth. Mitchell's lawyer, who had been sitting in quiet observation, now whispered something to his client. Mitchell, looking more defeated than ever, nodded slightly, but it was clear that the fight had left him. His earlier confidence had dissipated, and in its place was a deep sense of regret, not for his actions but for the fact that he had been outmaneuvered by a woman he had believed was beneath him. A woman who had shown him and everyone in the room that power could not be measured by a badge alone, but by the strength of one's character and resolve. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp final thud, signaling that the time had come for the verdict. The room held its breath, the tension unbearable. Mariah, who had been holding it together with a quiet strength throughout the trial, now felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She was ready for whatever would come next. She had faced her accuser, had stood her ground, and had exposed the truth. The outcome was no longer in her hands, but in the hands of those who had witnessed everything unfold. The jury filed back into the room, their expressions grave but thoughtful. They sat in silence as the foreperson stood, looking around the room before speaking. Mariah's heart raced in her chest, the sound of her pulse deafening in her ears. This was it. The moment she had been fighting for, the moment that would define everything she had worked for. The foreperson cleared their throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty on all charges." In that moment, everything changed. The years of struggle, the countless hours of work, the painful experiences, everything she had endured had led her here. She wasn't just a survivor of a broken system. She was proof that change was possible, that justice could be achieved. And though the battle was over for her in that courtroom, she knew that her fight for a fairer, more just world was only just beginning.